Hey everybody, Greg here. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, talking to you about my theory, the psychopathic selection hypothesis, or PSH. I wanted to put this together just because I know a lot of you have maybe read some of my essays or have looked at the book, but I thought I'd maybe provide some visuals and maybe look at this as kind of a lesson plan that maybe introduces you to some of the concepts that I talk about in the overall theory. So without further ado, kind of walk you through the agenda and some of the topics that I'm going to cover in the next 30 minutes. Again, that's an approximate time. It could be it could be 40 minutes. I'm not entirely sure. I'm just sort of riffing it here, but hopefully you find this useful. So I'm going to build the psychopathic selection hypothesis from the ground up. I'll start by defining symbolic selection and asking what changes when the same human organism moves from small reciprocal groups into scaled symbolic systems like markets, corporations, and financial systems. So I'm going to introduce all of these concepts. My hope is that you maybe looked at the essays or you've become familiar with the book to some extent, but I will be defining a lot of these concepts as we run through. And then we'll look at where strategies come from a game theoretic perspective. Again, I'll use the neuroscience of psychopathy to show how differences in reward sensitivity, emotional inhibition, empathy, and social decision making can produce a different behavioral repertoire. I'll run through an example just to make all of this, very clear in terms of what I'm talking about. What I'm calling the $1,000 example, which will make things a little bit more concrete, and that's item number 4 on the list there. From there, we'll ask a very specific question: what problems does psychopathy specifically solve, particularly when um, we insert this behavioral architecture inside of symbolic systems? So, things like controlling autonomous actors, capturing resources, avoiding consequences, winning positional competitions, and influencing the rules of the game board. Then we get into the game theory a little bit more, let's say a little bit deeper. I'm going to show how strategies used to solve these particular problems can actually generate new games, including entrapment games, resource control games, and so on, and how those same patterns can reappear at institutional scale, what I call, in the theory, institutional mirroring. And then finally, we'll look at symbolic selection itself, how successful strategies or behavioral strategies become embedded in incentives, technologies, rules, and of course institutions, until institutions begin preserving the results of previous selection and imposing them on the next generation of actors entering into the system. So we're moving from the original game board to the brain to the strategy to games again, and ultimately to institutions as evolutionary environments. So yeah, I'm going to get into basically the thick of it and try to unpack as much as I possibly can over the next 30 minutes or so. So going on to the next slide here, again, I just want to maybe introduce the theory holistically if you're new to it. Really, at the end of the day, I ask a very, I suppose, a simple question: what happens when human beings stop competing for resources, status, and reproduction, primarily inside small tribal systems, and begin competing for those same things inside enormous symbolic systems like markets, corporations, financial systems, nation states, and so on, where access to biological survival itself is mediated through symbolic infrastructure? That is really the starting question of the psychopathic selection hypothesis. And so the easiest way to understand PSH is to begin with the game board rather than with psychopathy. Human beings evolved for most of our history in relatively small, persistent groups when survival depended heavily upon other people. So in a small tribal system, if I exploit you today, I probably encounter you tomorrow. You know who I am, you remember what I did, you can withdraw cooperation, tell other people, you can tattle on me, you can retaliate, or you can exclude me from the group altogether, right? So, evolutionary biologists, evolutionary game theorists, anthropologists have known this for a long time. So people like Trivers, Axelrod, Nowak from a game theory perspective, and Christopher Bohm help explain why cooperation can become adaptive under these very specific tribal conditions. It isn't because human beings are inherently good. It's because, repeated interaction changes a payoff structure. So exploitation can produce an immediate reward in a tribal system, but it can also generate future costs when consequences remain visible and attributable to the individual causing harm. So, in other words, exploitation is an expensive strategy. So let's move to the scaled symbolic system. So now keep essentially the same human organism, but radically change the game board or the adaptive environment. We still need food, shelter, security, and access to resources, but we obtain them through primarily symbolic systems. I need money to buy food. I need wages or capital to obtain money. Housing is mediated through property, rent, mortgages, and credit. Employment is mediated through corporations' contracts and credentials, like a degree. These symbolic or symbols have no biological value by themselves, but they have become gateways to things that absolutely do. The organism remains biological, while access to biological necessity becomes increasingly filtered through these types of abstractions. And essentially, long story long, that changes the selection environment in my view. Inside scaled symbolic systems, reward and consequence can be separated. I can receive the financial reward here in the institution while somebody else absorbs the human or ecological cost somewhere else, far, far away, and perhaps years later. So PSH asks a game theoretic question. If we change the boundary conditions of the game board, do we change the relative fitness of the behavioral strategies competing inside it? And if instrumental strategies, I mean those that are psychopathic, become less expensive and more rewarding under some of those conditions, what happens when they repeatedly win? My argument is that successful behavioral strategies generate games. Those games can become institutionalized, and eventually the logic that was selected or symbolically selected begins shaping the game board itself. Um, let's not forget, we created symbolic systems to organize a biological life, our lives. PSH asks what happens when those systems become selection environments in their own right, and what I say, what I call evolutionary fields in and of themselves. So let's talk a little bit about, the boundary conditions. I think it's super important to cover this topic. So same species, different game board. We talked about the tribal game board. We talked about scaled symbolic game boards. So this slide makes the argument more precise because they don't want to say something ridiculous like tribal societies were cooperative and modern societies are psychopathic. That's not correct. The claim is conditional. Think of the game board as a vector of parameters determining the expected payoff of a particular strategy. Feedback delay, probability of detection, probability of retaliation, capacity to externalize cost, information control, abstraction of the objective function, concentration of reward, and the ability for winners to modify the rules. Move those parameters and the payoff matrix changes, meaning let's move those boundary conditions around and maybe some strategies win, other strategies lose, and so on. So the strategy hasn't magically become morally better or worse. This is not an argument of morality. This is an argument of governing dynamics, right? This is an argument of human nature. Its relative fitness has changed. So let's take exploitation, all right, as a strategy. In a tightly coupled tribal group, suppose I capture, 10 units of reward by cheating you or exploiting you. If there's a high probability you'll identify me, future interaction is likely, reputation propagates through the group, and exclusion threatens my own survival, then my apparent 10-unit gain carries a large expected future penalty, meaning exploitation is quite expensive. That's why persistent defection or cheating becomes quite expensive. My essays, my book explicitly describes small group environments as repeated games in which reputation changes subsequent outcomes, and short-term defection or cheating accumulates future costs. Now let's invert the boundary conditions of the game board. So we go from, on the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Look at those particular boundary conditions. So suppose now detection is weak for causing harm. Suppose, I can be anonymous because of abstraction. Maybe consequences for causing harm arrives 5 years later. Accountability or liability can be dispersed through an organization, through abstraction, and I can externalize most of the loss while retaining or concentrating the reward. So getting reward has low risk for me when I deploy an instrumental strategy. So the expected cost of the same instrumental move collapses. That's the PSH argument in mathematical language. We're moving from a tightly coupled region of parameter space in a tribal setting toward a weakly coupled region in which instrumental strategies become comparatively cheaper, again, in the scaled symbolic system from that perspective, inside of markets, inside of corporations, and so forth. But not universally. Regulation, transparency, and punishment can move the parameters back. But under identifiable boundary conditions, that's the key here. That makes the hypothesis testable rather um, than metaphorical, right? So just to recap, right? In tribal systems, cooperation can be a relatively cheap and stable strategy because of the continuous interaction between actors in a game that might contain 25 or 50 people. There's memory, there's constant feedback. If I interact with you today, the expectation of interacting with you tomorrow is quite high, right? Obviously, that changes when we get into scaled symbolic systems, where we look at the fact that reputation and reciprocity weakens. I can be anonymous. We're talking about the interaction of millions of people, and so instrumental strategies in this case can be quite cheap to deploy, and they may outcompete reciprocal strategies. So the boundary conditions, very important to the theory here. But I think moving forward to the next slide, um, I think it's important to really understand, some of the key contributions of PSH, and from a game theoretic perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, where do strategies actually come from, right? So moving a level deeper, I want to move here because game theory usually gives us an actor and a set of possible strategies and then asks which strategy the actor will choose. But I'm interested in something that happens before that choice. What kind of nervous system is doing the choosing? What kind of mind is choosing the particular strategies? And I think psychopathy is a particularly interesting computational profile because when we look at the work of neuroscientists, psychologists, and so on, like Blair, Kent Keel, Buchholz, and others, they've spent decades identifying differences in neural systems involved in emotion, reinforcement learning, reward, punishment, and decision making. That doesn't mean their research suggests, okay, there's a single psychopathy circuit. There isn't. What we're looking at is a distributed architecture in which several components of the decision process appear to be weighted differently, right? So when we start looking at the brain architecture itself, let's look at the amygdala. So Blair's work, and I invite you to read up on Blair's work, James Blair's work, is especially important here. So when we think about the amygdala, it helps us learn the emotional significance of events, including Distress and punishment cues. If another person's fear or suffering normally enters my decision process as a powerful negative signal, that can inhibit strategies that harm them, right? In psychopathy, particularly in individuals high in callous unemotional traits, that signaling and reinforcement learning process appears to be quite altered. So another person's distress may exert less braking force on the decision. In simple terms, um, if I have to hurt somebody to get a reward, that hurting of the other individual or that other person's distress may not be weighted heavily in my decision-making process. Um, then we look at another part of the brain called the ventral striatum, which is heavily involved in reward anticipation and reinforcement. So there's a lot of research that associates psychopathic traits with an unusually strong reward-related responding in parts of the system. Now, the weighting begins to become very interesting from an anticipation of reward perspective. The anticipated reward can be highly salient, while some of the effective and punishment signals that normally constrain pursuit of that reward are weaker. So again, if going after status, legitimacy, money, affection, etc., means I have to hurt somebody, I may weigh other people's distress quite. It may not be weighted heavily in my decision-making process. And then we have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or what's called the VMPFC, together with the broader paralimbic abnormalities emphasized by Kent Keel. Again, highly recommend reading Kent Keel's research. The VMPFC is important because it helps integrate reward, punishment, emotion, and social information into the valuation decision-making process. So think of it less as the moral center of the brain and more as a part of the machinery constructing the value of different actions. So again, if I'm a psychopath and I want to achieve reward, and we'll go into this a little bit later, I may evaluate, does fear come into the equation? Does hurting somebody come into the equation? What's my detection? What's my probability? What's the probability of being detected for causing harm? What's the probability that somebody is going to retaliate? Again, the same the way in which I make decisions is far different than what normal or reciprocal or pro-social actors would ultimately make decisions. And Keel's work suggests psychopathy involves abnormalities across a broader paralimbic network rather than one, quote unquote, damaged location. Now, I think what's important here, a lot of neuroscience was covered, but now put those pieces together computationally, right? And there's much more. There's the ACC, there's the insula, there's the parahippocampal regions. For simplicity, I just wanted to keep this short and sweet. But anyways, going back, now put those pieces together computationally. And, imagine two actors considering the same strategy. Both see a potential reward, both understand what the other person is likely to feel, but the terms entering their internal calculation can carry different weights. For one actor, attachment, guilt, another person's distress, and anticipated punishment may impose substantial negative value on exploitation. For the psychopathic actor, those costs may be attenuated while reward dominance or a successful acquisition remains highly salient. Instrumental strategies, in other words, are cheaper to explore and to act upon for those with psychopathy. That doesn't mechanically produce deception, dominance, or exploitation. The brain is not issuing a command that says, manipulate this person. What it can do is change the relative expected value of available strategies. A strategy that feels psychologically expensive to one actor can be considerably cheaper to another. That's the point. And that's where this becomes extremely interesting for PSH, because now I can take this empirically studied computational architecture and place it inside different game boards. If I put it inside a small reciprocal environment where exploitation is visible, all of those boundary conditions that I talked about earlier, retaliation is likely and reputation follows the actor. The external environment can make exploitation expensive, even when its internal psychological cost is low. But put the same psychopathic architecture inside a symbolic system where reward is concentrated, consequences can be externalized. Attribution is weak and retaliation is delayed, and now both sides of the calculation can move in the same direction. The reward remains salient, while both the internal and external costs of instrumental behavior can be reduced. So architecture is upstream of strategy, but architecture alone doesn't determine selection. The architecture generates a particular decision landscape. The symbolic environment determines which strategies that landscape makes available are actually rewarded. And so I think what we want to do here is maybe go through a real quick example in terms of, bringing that neuroscience, that neurology to life, that computational architecture to life with a simple problem, right? So the $1,000 problem. Now let's make it concrete. So give two actors the same objective, acquire $1,000, and hold the external environment constant. Same information, same rules, same opponents, same amount of money. A strongly reciprocal actor may consider work, negotiation, exchange, or mutually beneficial cooperation. They could deceive, manipulate, or threaten the other actor, but those moves may carry large endogenous costs, right? They may feel guilt or anxiety, reputational concern, attachment damage, or fear of retaliation. So although those strategies exist formally in the reciprocal actor, they're expensive inside the actor's utility function, right? So let's think about the instrumental actor on the right hand side. The effective strategy space can actually be wider, right? They might cooperate too. This is important, but cooperation can be used instrumentally rather than treated as an end in itself. They can model the other actor, misrepresent intentions, manipulate information, manufacture trust, create dependency, or exploit a difference if those strategies maximize expected reward. Psychopathy, therefore, is an equivalent to constant defection. In fact, indiscriminate defection would often be strategically, I hate to say it, stupid. The more interesting architecture is capable of conditional cooperation when cooperation is useful, and defection or cheating or exploitation when exploitation becomes profitable. My book makes this distinction very, very explicit. Trust can become an exploitable variable, right? If somebody trusts me, I can exploit that. While influence and symbolic legitimacy can be more adaptive than overt violence because they preserve access to reward while reducing resistance. Again, coercion is metabolically expensive for the psychopath. They'd prefer to pacify their target so that they can stabilize extraction. That gives us a different game theoretic object. External strategy sets may be identical while realized strategy sets differ because internal costs differ. And this is the innovation. Game theory assumes that all players have access to the same strategy space. That's incomplete. Behavioral architectures clearly have different realizable strategy spaces. A reciprocal actor, they may think about exploitation, but it's too costly to them. Their architecture it may not even come into the strategy space for them. Whereas a psychopathic actor or an instrumental actor, their strategy space is far different. Exploitation is cheaper, and in fact, manipulation, deceit, instrumental use of others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, potentially comes into the strategy space or is already in the strategy space already. And so PSH then asks what happens when the surrounding game board systematically discounts exactly those internal restraints. I think that's an important point, right? And so under those conditions, the architecture capable of exploring more of the instrumental strategy space, this is a symbolic selection claim, may obtain a persistent payoff advantage. So instrumental strategies may, in fact, outcompete cooperative strategies. And so let's move on to the next slide. I think this is, fundamentally important to talk about as well. What are the problems that psychopathy solves? So this is where I want to stop treating psychopathy as a static inventory of traits and instead ask a more game theoretic question. What recurring strategic problems might this behavioral architecture solve, and what kinds of games are generated when those solutions are repeated over time, right? And this is something also innovative and new from a game theoretic perspective, right? What you know, based on the problems that the particular behavioral architecture is solving, what kinds of games are actually produced from those solutions. And so as we go through, I'll do this at a high level. There's more information in my essays and particularly my book about some of these things here. But the five problems, there's more on the slide, are not five isolated traits of psychopathy. There are five sources of uncertainty or constraint inside a symbolic game board. The important move is that the solution changes the state of the interaction. And once that state changes enough, a new game emerges. So, I've write about this a lot, the target autonomy problem in my essays and so forth, right? So if I'm a psychopathic actor and you're a target, my future payoff depends on um, an autonomous actor who can refuse the relationship, they can leave the relationship, they can retaliate or pursue an objective that conflicts with mine. A reciprocal actor solves that problem by keeping the relationship mutually valuable enough that the other person continues the relationship voluntarily. An instrumental actor can solve the target autonomy problem differently. They can use all of their behavioral characteristics, social modeling, strategic deceit, manipulation, pathological lying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to model the target, shape the target's beliefs, build dependency in the target, escalate commitment, suppress alternatives, and increase the exit cost of the relationship. If those strategies work repeatedly, the result is no longer just successful manipulation of another person. The relationship itself changes. The target has fewer realistic alternatives and more to lose from leaving the relationship. That is how a dependency, compliance, or entrapment game emerges. Think of it like as an abusive relationship, right? In simple terms. All that I've done here is I've mathematically decomposed the computational architecture of psychopathy and evaluate it through the types of games that it could potentially produce. And so the next game on the list here is what I call the resource control problem, or the problem. It works the same way. Initially, the problem is simply that a scarce resource is contested. An instrumental solution is to capture the resource, exclude rivals, control distribution, and create leverage over those who still need access. Once access to the resource determines what everybody else can do, the interaction has changed from ordinary competition into a capture or gatekeeping game. The strategic issue is no longer who owns the resource, it is who controls the pathway through which others must reach or access the resource. The next problem is consequence avoidance. The problem is that reward acquisition often produces costs, especially if you're solving, let's say, the target autonomy problem, where you're trying to make your target's behavior predictable so that you can stabilize reward acquisition. So with consequence avoidance, when you're trying to access reward from your target, um, it can produce various costs, right? Maybe punishment if you're discovered, retaliation if you're discovered, liability if you're discovered, reputational damage or harm to others. If an actor can systematically retain the reward while hiding and concealing attribution, diffusing responsibility, or moving the cost outward, then repeated success produces an externalization, or what I call an opacity game. The actor receiving the payoff is separated from the actor carrying the downside. So an example of this is a psychopathic actor creating legal frameworks to protect themselves from accountability. Listen, I dumped, a ton of oil into the ocean, but I'm legally allowed to do that, right? Well, yeah, legally. Another abstraction to insulate actors causing harm from accountability, right? Um, so the next problem is the competitive position problem. This generates a different structure. If rewards depend on relative rank, then strategies that improve position against rivals, you know, dominance, aggressive reward pursuit, impression management, building coalitions with like minds, opportunistic defections, so cheating when it's not working out for the instrumental actor, can accumulate advantage. When winning today gives you more resources, visibility, and leverage tomorrow, the interaction becomes a dominance or what I call a tournament game. The prize isn't just the current reward. Winning changes your starting position in the next round, and that obviously gives you a strategic advantage. And the rule control problem, the last one on the list here, is the recursive endpoint. Even after I win, my future payoff remains uncertain if competitors can re-enter or somebody else can change the rules. I gotta maintain power over the rules. So the strongest instrumental solution is to convert present success into influence over the rules, metric standards, or enforcement. Once that happens, we have a capture or lock-in game. Right, again, the interesting thing about symbolic systems is that the winners can rewrite the rules of quote unquote gravity, right? They can rewrite the rules of symbolic nature, if you want to call it that. So the winner is no longer outperforming others inside the game. The winner is shaping the conditions under which future competition occurs. And you can't do that in nature, but you can do it in symbolic systems, right? So the key idea on this slide is that games are downstream of problem solving, right? They're produced from these problems that psychopathy actually solves in symbolic systems. So behavioral architectures generate solutions to recurring strategic problems in symbolic systems. Repeated solutions alter dependency of other actors, access of other actors, attribution to causing harm, rank and rules. And when those state changes become stable enough, they produce recognizable game families. Entrapment games, gatekeeping games, externalization games, tournament games, and so on and so forth. That's the bridge from psychopathic architecture to the emergence of games. And so let's move along here. And so let's talk about, how do games actually emerge, right? Like, you know, game theory, we assume we look at tit for tat or the tragedy of the commons or prisoner's dilemma. We look at, you could look at chess. These are all synthetic games. They don't talk about how games are in nature actually emerge. Like where are games generate? How do games get generated, especially in human systems? That's where my research is innovating, right? I'm looking at what's the governing dynamics of how games actually emerge. And so this is probably the point where we're departing most clearly from the simplified, as I said, the simplified way games are often presented. We normally begin with the game already specified. Here are the players, here are the strategies, here are the payoffs. Now solve for the equilibrium, right? John Nash. But human social games often aren't given in that form. The players actually generate the game through repeated interaction. Behavioral architecture generates a strategy. The strategy changes another actor's internal model. That changes the relationship. The changed relationship changes the realistic strategy set in the next round. The next round is the next time I interact with you. When we first meet, I don't know anything about you, right? Over time, trust withers, trust builds. I learn about, I've got more information. And so I can build a model of the relationship based on that repeated interaction. But what's happening is a game is actually being produced. And that changes future payoffs. And so that sequence, that constant interaction that I just described, it is recursive. So let's, very simple, imagine I want your continued participation in the relationship. A reciprocal solution is straightforward. I make cooperation valuable enough that you voluntarily return. But an instrumental actor can solve the same, again, if you have something that I want. They can solve the target autonomy problem by modeling your vulnerabilities, right? What do you like? What do you dislike? Trying to present themselves in alignment with who you are, manufacturing trust through deceit, encouraging commitments, creating dependency. They're playing one game. That game is, I want reward from you. You see another game. You see a cooperative game. You think the game's equal, but it's not, because the psychopathic or instrumental actor is concealing their true intention. So they create dependency, and then they increase the cost of exit so that they can stabilize extraction. You respond to apparent cooperation with genuine cooperation. You invest money, reveal information, decline alternatives, perhaps become emotionally or financially dependent on the relationship. The point is that your strategy set at time X is no longer your strategy set as at time Y. My previous actions have altered it. I haven't optimized inside the game. I've changed the state variables from which the next game is constructed, for because each interaction makes you update what you think the game is, and it's not the same game. That's the generative claim. Repeated strategies endogenously modify beliefs, relationships, feasible choices, and payoffs of the target actor. If that process produces dependency, the resulting equilibrium can be what I call loss dominant. I talk about it in my essays, I talk about it in my book. In other words, in very simple terms, a loss dominant equilibrium is, hey, you continue participating not because staying in the relationship is particularly good, but because leaving has become worse. The game is therefore an output of interaction rather than, just its starting condition, right? So that is about how games emerge. Let's move on to um, how these games become mirrored in institutions. So now take exactly that computational sequence and remove the individual psychopath. This is where institutional mirroring becomes important. I'm not saying a corporation has an amygdala or that a bureaucracy experiences grandiosity. I'm saying institutions can solve the same strategic problems using the same homologous mechanisms, right? The implementation changes, the computational function remains very recognizable. My book calls institutions cognitive fossils in the sense behavioral patterns rewarded within symbolic civilization can become externalized into durable structures through symbolic selection. So take solving the target autonomy problem. Interpersonally, an instrumental actor can make another person more predictable by generating dependency. Institutionally, this shows up computationally in the form of wages, debt, credentials, pensions, or platform lock-in can perform the same strategic function. Resource control, the game that I talked about earlier, becomes gatekeeping. Whoever owns the platform, infrastructure, or credentialing pathway determines who gets access. Consequence avoidance becomes, externalization. An organization retains revenue while pollution, health costs, or employment insecurity are pushed onto other actors outside the accounting boundary or the social body. Competitive positioning, it turns into tournaments, rankings, um, rankings, promotion systems, market share contests. Rule control becomes lobbying, regulatory capture, standard setting, or metric design. Listen, I'm going through this very quickly. I'm just giving you a high level overview of this. Obviously, I delve into this a lot deeper in the actual framework. And this is critical. This is the critical difference. Selection doesn't need to reproduce the personality. It only needs to preserve the strategy's function, right? That's why institutional psychopathy, as I'm using the term, is an isomorphism claim. That's a mathematical claim saying there's a map from the mind to the institution. So it's an isomorphism claim rather than a diagnostic claim. Different substrate, different implementation, same strategic problem, recognizably similar solution, right? For example, in debt, um, you have dependency formation, strategy space compression, entrapment in the form of switching costs, and so on and so forth, right? I'll go through this in all of my essays. I also go through it in my book. So now let's get to a solid example. Like we've talked about, how psychopathy solves particular problems in symbolic systems, um, and what kinds of games are produced from those solutions, right? So I wanted to go through how an entrapment game is generated. Excuse me. So how does an entrapment game actually emerge? Let's look at what happens when a psychopath solves the target autonomy problem. The problem is simple. My future reward depends upon another, again, being repetitive here, depends upon another autonomous person. You can refuse me, you can leave, you can change your mind, you can stop cooperating. So, from the perspective of an instrumental actor, your autonomy creates uncertainty around my future reward. A cooperative actor solves this problem through reciprocity. I give you enough value that you continue participating voluntarily. I respect your autonomy because the relationship works when we're both benefiting from it. But a psychopath has access to a different set of strategies, as I discussed before. I study you. I can learn what you want, what you fear, what makes you feel safe. I can mimic your interests, manage the impression you have of me, selectively reveal information and conceal my actual intentions through superficial charm and mimicry and strategic deceit. The objective isn't to persuade you today, it's to make your behavior tomorrow more predictable through continuous interaction. And the really interesting part is that you may not realize we're playing different games. I understand the interaction instrumentally, but you may understand it reciprocally. You think we're building trust. So you respond with genuine trust. You disclose information. You become emotionally invested. Maybe you invest money. You make commitments. You turn down other opportunities. And every one of those decisions begins changing the game because it's a game. Because 6 months later, you're not standing where you were when we met, you now have something to lose. Dependency has increased. You've become emotionally attached. Alternatives may have disappeared, or you don't want to take the alternatives because you're attached. Leaving has become more expensive. In PSH, that's dependency formation and strategy space compression. In plain language, my strategies have progressively reduced the number of realistic choices available to you because your neurocognitive impression or your meta model of the relationship has fundamentally changed over continuous interaction. Eventually, we can reach a point where staying is harmful, but leaving is even more costly. Maybe staying gives you a payoff of -3. Um, but leaving today but leaving today gives you -10. Staying is therefore still the locally rational move. That's what I call a lost dominant equilibrium, and that's the key insight. I don't need to continuously threaten or force you anymore. I've changed the game so that the game produces the behavior I want. So domination doesn't occur through coercion or violence. I don't employ those strategies until I need to stabilize the equilibrium. A cheaper strategy is to entrap you, to make domination feel self-regulating, right? So now let's do the institutional mirroring, right? So now look at debt institutionally. A borrower can know that carrying high interest debt is harmful over the long term and still rationally make the next payment because default creates larger immediate losses. Damaged credit, penalties, collections, potentially the loss of an asset or housing. The cost of continuing is distributed through time. The cost of deviation is concentrated in the present. PSH describes the same mechanism as obligations reducing flexibility until continued participation becomes locally necessary. So that's how entrapment games emerge, right? The psychopath solves the target autonomy problem by changing the other person's decision environment. The strategies create dependency. Dependency removes alternatives from the target. Fewer alternatives increases exit costs for the target, and eventually the target's own rational decision making stabilizes the game. And we see these entrapment or loss dominance dynamics in wage dependency, debt, surveillance, propaganda, and many other control um, technologies in today's society because cities, states, and even countries require citizens, workers, and others to be behaviorally predictable in order to stabilize continued asymmetric reward acquisition. And again, these computational implementations emerge from symbolic selection, right? And so I'm going to go to another game very quickly and talk about how the resource control game is generated. So, how does a resource control game emerge, and why might a psychopathic architecture or an instrumental architecture have an advantage in generating one? Start with the resource control problem. There is something scarce that multiple actors want. Maybe it's capital, maybe it's land, maybe it's customers, maybe it's information, maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's market access. A reciprocal actor can solve that problem through exchange, negotiated access, sharing, or cooperation. But an instrumental actor has a different behavioral repertoire available. The question becomes not how do I get some of that resource, but how do I gain enough control over the resource that I can determine who else gets access to it? This is where the psychology of psychopathy and the neuroscience becomes interesting. Dominance seeking, strong reward orientation, reduced effective concern for competitors, other people's distress, strategic deception, manipulation, and instrumental social reasoning can all change the effective cost of aggressive resource acquisition. I really want something and I need to control it. If excluding a competitor harms them, a reciprocal actor may treat that harm as a cost. If I have strong attachment to colleagues or partners, I may also resist strategies that maximize my position by damaging theirs. For an instrumental actor, those social constraints can carry less weight, and in fact likely do. The resource and the control it provides can remain highly salient, while some of the interpersonal costs of acquiring it are discounted. That doesn't mean psychopaths automatically dominate every competition. It means that under the right boundary conditions that we talked about earlier, low probability for detection, low probability for detection of causing harm, anonymity, weak feedback, et cetera, et cetera. There's 15 different boundary conditions. Under those particular conditions, some strategies required for aggressive capture can be psychologically cheaper to execute. Now imagine that happening repeatedly. I don't, just acquire more customers. I acquire the distribution channel through which competitors reach those customers. I don't just acquire information. I acquire the database and decide who can use it. A platform doesn't just compete with sellers. Once enough buyers and sellers depend on the platform, it can determine visibility, fees, rankings, and access. At that point, winning has changed the next round of the game. And this is where the PSH argument becomes more than a story about dominance. Resource capture generates leverage creates dependency reduces alternatives, and sufficient control over access can eventually become control over the rules. Again, control over the rules of the game are huge. The actor is no longer competing for the resource, they're beginning to determine the conditions under which everybody else competes for it. That's how a gatekeeping game emerges. And game theoretically, that's important because the payoff from winning isn't just the resource itself. The winner acquires the ability to modify the future strategy space of other players. Success today changes the game tomorrow. So, um, what that means is the selection argument is quite specific. If an instrumental architecture is more willing to pursue dominance, exploit information advantages, exclude competitors, and convert resources into control, and if the symbolic environment rewards those strategies more than it punishes them, then that behavioral repertoire can generate higher symbolic fitness than a reciprocal strategy that voluntarily preserves access for others. In other words, sharing, right? Eventually, the resource isn't just something inside the game. Control of the resource becomes control of the game board itself. So let's keep moving here over to, so maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going way over here. But, why the same game reappears at institutional scale. And this is where we begin to understand why the same kinds of games keep reappearing at institutional scale, right? A corporation, a government, a bank, an employer, a digital platform look like completely different systems. They have different objectives, different rules, and different technologies, but underneath those differences, they repeatedly encounter versions of the same strategic problems we've already described. They depend on autonomous people whose future behavior they cannot completely control. Workers can leave, borrowers can default, customers can buy somewhere else, citizens can refuse to comply, users can leave a platform. So institutions have an enormous incentive to reduce that uncertainty and make future behavior more predictable for the sake of extracting more. And there are very different ways of doing that. A reciprocal system can make participation valuable enough that people voluntarily continue. An employer can pay people well, provide security, and share productivity gains. A platform can remain useful while making it easy to leave and take your data somewhere else. A lender can structure a loan so that both parties benefit from the borrower remaining financially healthy. Like, hey, if you lose your job, will pause your debt. That doesn't happen in today's reality. In each case, behavior becomes relatively predictable because the interests of the actors remain reasonably aligned. I continue participating because continuing works for me too. But an instrumental system can solve exactly the same problem by changing my alternatives. An employer doesn't necessarily need my loyalty if losing my wage threatens my ability to pay rent. A creditor doesn't need me to enjoy carrying debt if default creates an immediate financial crisis. A platform doesn't need to physically prevent me from leaving if my customers' reputation data and social network are difficult to move somewhere else. Surveillance can increase the probability that deviation is detected. Credentials can determine which jobs I'm allowed to perform. Contracts can increase the cost of exit. Blah, 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 blah. So, what we're seeing are institutional versions of the same games we generated at the interpersonal level. Dependency produces entrapment games. Resource control produces gatekeeping games. Moving consequences onto other actors produces externalization games. Concentrating rewards around relative rank produces tournament games. And converting the present success into control over standards, contracts, or regulation produces lock in games. And that's why these patterns can recur in completely different institutions. PSH isn't claiming that institutions consciously think like psychopaths. The claim is that they repeatedly confront similar strategic problems, and selection can preserve instrumental solutions when those solutions generate higher symbolic payoffs. So the important distinction isn't simply cooperation versus coercion, it's how stable behavior is being produced. Um, a reciprocal system stabilizes participation by preserving mutual benefit and meaningful alternatives. An instrumental system can stabilize participation by making deviation from the system very expensive, and in fact, existential. From the outside, both systems can look stable, but game theoretically, one preserves your ability to choose, the other actually makes the choice for you, which is pretty haunting. And so, let's talk about how, so a couple more slides here. Let's talk about how interpersonal strategies become institutional technologies, right? Now we can make institutional mirroring even more precise. What begins as an interpersonal strategy can become a technology. Social modeling, the instrumental actors' desire to collect data on their targets can become analytics and profiling. Strategic deception in the psychopath becomes misleading metrics, selective disclosure, propaganda. Information control becomes bureaucratic opacity. Um, again, we see this in society, right? Like elites are opaque. They've got shell accounts. They've got family offices. Good luck trying to understand their financial situation, right, with private equity and things like that. Whereas, citizens and workers, we're all highly visible. So there's this asymmetric visibility. So that's an example of information control, proprietary systems, data silos, and so on. Dependency formation, um, we see this all the time, wage dependency, debt. You need a credential to access, get a job. Platform dependency, switching costs, it's pretty obvious. Reward scheduling becomes, bonuses, rankings, gamification, get people addicted. Strategy space compression becomes switching costs and contractual constraints. So again, make your exit from the game really, really difficult because leaving becomes not only costly from one dimension, but across a number of different dimensions, right? That's what keeps you playing the game. And then rule modification becomes, lobbying, regulatory capture, and metric design, right? So let's ensure the winners of the game keep winning. And so notice what's happened. We no longer require an instrumental actor to execute the strategy consciously because the institution has automated the function. A manager can leave and the KPI remains. An executive can die and the compensation architecture remains. The person who designed a debt instrument disappears and the repayment schedule continues shaping behavior for decades. This is why the institution is theoretically important. It gives successful strategic logic memory, or what I talked about earlier, becomes a cognitive fossil. Game theoretically, we're moving from strategies encoded in agents to strategies encoded into the environment or the operating system itself. The rules, payoff weights, and information conditions now reproduce behavior even when the next generation of players has different intentions. My book makes this argument explicitly. Once strategic asymmetries become institutionalized, they appear in rules, incentives, metrics, and informational architectures. And institutions themselves specify the rules, payoffs, information conditions, and the equilibrium behavior of the social game. Um, that's a much stronger claim than saying institutions resemble psychopaths. The institution has become a persistent implementation of a previously successful strategy or set of strategies that are actually instrumental. And then, last but not least, let's close out by talking about institutions becoming evolutionary fields. And of course, this is another novel contribution of PSH. We think of them as institutions as not as games. They are and they are evolutionary fields. And this final slide closes the loop, right? So because now symbolic selection is recursive, imagine organizations competing for capital, market share, status, or institutional survival. Some organizational architectures generate higher measured returns than others. Those organizations expand, attract capital, acquire competitors through M&A. They reproduce their operating logic. Organizations that systematically accept costs their competitors externalize may actually be punished by the game board. And I talk about this in great detail in my book and my essays, and I'm trying to keep this as short as possible because there's so much to unpack. Um, but there's a direct example in there about labor. If one firm internalizes worker well-being while competitors suppress wages, outsource risk and externalize health costs, the reciprocal firm can face higher costs and lower margins under weak regulation and mobile capital. But here's the recursive move, right? The winners don't just receive more payoff, they acquire game board modifying capacity. Their objective functions like profit, productivity, efficiency KPIs, and so on become embedded in accounting standards, compensation systems, contracts, algorithms, governance rules, and capital allocation mechanisms. The next actor, therefore, doesn't enter the original game. A new hire at a university isn't entering the original game. They enter a game partially constructed by previous winners. In evolutionary language, the environment now contains information about previous selection events, right? So that's what I mean when I say institutions become evolutionary fields. Selection operates on strategies. Winning strategies alter institutions. Institutions alter the payoff landscape. The altered landscape changes which strategies become adaptive in the next round. So we get a recursive map: objective function, strategy, payoff advantage, institutionalization, modified boundary conditions, new selection pressure, right? So classical game theory usually asks what rational actors do um, given a particular game. Instead, PSH is asking something more generative. Again, I go back to generative, governing dynamics. What happens when the strategies that win are capable of rewriting the game that determines what wins next? And I think as I close out, we really need to think about the boundary conditions, right, of modern symbolic systems. They absolutely make instrumental strategies cheaper, and therefore, um, who are most apt at deploying those instrumental strategies. So I was wrong. It wasn't 30 minutes. It was actually twice as long. But thank you for your time, and I hope you found this educational. Bye for now.